Two of the most polarising characters in Invincible have to be Scott Duvall, aka Powerplex, and Angstrom Levy. Two villains of our hero who each view Mark as an evil and destructive entity that the world would be better off without. Both seek to tear down Invincible, to either make him face justice or to be made to suffer for his crimes. But the main thing that ties these two antagonists together is that neither is right. Not even in like a my ideology versus your ideology kind of way. No, these two are flat out wrong for placing the blame on Invincible, and this in itself says a lot about the way this series explores the idea of grief and acceptance, which is of course what we shall explore today. Starting off with Angstrom Levy. Now Angstrom was once a good man, blessed with the power to travel the multiverse, who aimed to create a utopia. He genuinely wanted what was best for the world, and so used his knowledge of the multiverse and his other variants to try achieve this. However, Invincible, mistaking his intentions, tried to stop him, leading to Invincible almost being beaten to death. This is the moment Angstrom, who did not want his utopia built on blood, forcefully unplugged himself from his machine. This resulted in the Angstrom we know today, a mind overloaded with too much knowledge. With so many minds inside his own, what made our Angstrom was drowned out. To try keep his overflowing mind together, he needed to fixate on one thing. Had to keep it from falling apart by projecting it all onto the last thing his brain was thinking about before it was overloaded. Invincible. Invincible wasn't trying to hurt him or turn him into the thing he is today. And deep down, Angstrom knows this. But that part of him that knows all this is drowned out by his anger. Angstrom, with a multiverse's worth of Mark hate, begins to forget who he as an individual is. He forgets his own goals of a utopia, a world he could now try to create, and instead spends all his time trying to prove Invincible is evil, be it by forcing him to lash out by taking his mother hostage, or setting evil variants of him loose on the world. Because if he can prove he is right, that Invincible is evil, then he can prove to himself that he is still him, that his perception of reality is correct, that he himself isn't gone. In short, Angstrom is desperately trying to prove he is still sane, that he is still himself by forcing reality to conform to what he thinks is true. He's not insane for thinking Invincible is evil, if he proves that he is. The reason he doesn't care about the actually evil Marks, the ones who had killed the friends and family of his own variants, is because those Marks don't matter. All that matters is our Mark, the Invincible that his rage is directed against. In a way, this targeted rage is all that is keeping him together, is what gives him a purpose. Angstrom started with noble intentions, but he did this all to himself. He is a monster because of his own actions, yet unable to even know where he ends and his variants begin. He cannot take accountability. He cannot blame himself because he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know who Angstrom Levy is anymore, but he does know who Invincible is, and so that is all he can focus on. Which is not too dissimilar to Powerplex. Now Scott was once a happy man, with a sister and a niece he loved very much. But then Omni-Man vs Invincible happened, and they both were killed as collateral damage. And the worst part was that Powerplex was there when it happened, and he couldn't do anything about it. When he tried to help, he was thrown back by the mere presence of these superhuman gods. He was too weak to do anything. Despite having powers of his own, he was still powerless. The horror of watching it happen was bad enough, but then on top of that he survived while his family died. In that situation, I think many of us would feel the same. Survivor's guilt is what forced him to go crazy. He latched onto Invincible much like Angstrom, as he needed something to direct his anger towards. Most people aren't strong enough to just accept bad things happen. Most people need someone to blame. And Invincible fits the bill. Omni-Man was off the planet. He couldn't be held to anything, but Invincible was here, and worse, he was being praised as a hero. Invincible made himself easy to hate, at least from Scott's point of view. A villain being called a hero, acting as if he was the victim in that fight, when he caused the death of so many. He was within Scott's reach. Him facing justice, at least to Scott, seemed like something he could realistically achieve. Maybe this would give him the resolution to all this. Maybe then he'd accept that they are gone. When Scott saw Invincible, he saw him holding Jessica's arm. He didn't see him fighting his father. All he saw was Invincible and the severed limb of the niece he loved so much. When he thinks of Invincible, that's what he sees. When he thinks back to that day, that is what he sees. Scarred into his mind is the image of Invincible standing there alongside his father, holding the arm of his niece. Throw that on top of the survivor's guilt, and it's really not hard to see how Scott became the way he did. When he screams about why Invincible gets to live, when so many others died, this is Scott projecting his own feelings, his own survivor's guilt, onto Mark. He is too weak to hate himself, so he needs to hate Invincible instead. To him, what he feels is correct is justice, because he simply is not strong enough to see it any other way. And as a result, he drags others into his delusions, into his fear. His own wife and child are made complicit. Instead of using them for support to help him overcome his grief, he used them as further motivation for his unhealthy mindset. They allow each other to lean on one another. No, they just amplified each other's anger. Like a pollutant, Scott's hate infected his wife and child too, wrapping them up in the same trauma and leading them to suffer as well. When he adopts the persona of Powerplex, he seeks to fight Invincible and prove to the world his true nature, wants the world to see what he sees, make them understand his pain. In other words, he wants everyone else to relate to his pain. He wants the world to agree with him. He wants his hate for Invincible to be proven correct, to prove to himself that he is dealing with his trauma and not have to accept the truth that this is just an unhealthy coping mechanism. His wife, corrupted by his hatred, only acts as an echo chamber, allowing him to convince himself what he is doing is right, that it is justice. But it really isn't. When he used his powers in the name of his own justice, they cause collateral damage, falling rubble that could have hurt people, could have replicated exactly what Invincible supposedly did to his family. When people thought he had killed Shapesmith, he turned it on them, saying they saw what actually happened, trying to make them see what really happened, again self-projecting, for how he saw Invincible as a murderer with his own eyes, while others who weren't there didn't see the truth, and call him a hero. He scares his own child with his powers. The spark of hope in his life is literally put in danger by his powers. A power that is a literal embodiment of his trauma, with every hit he takes only powering him up. Like how everything he sees and hears only increases his revenge. Like the echo chamber that is his wife. His electrical discharge perhaps being a representation of the hate he must project onto the world in order to stay sane. He must make himself heard, must make everybody else understand. He interrupts a memorial, a way for those who lost people to grieve in a healthy way. Damages the monument that serves as a memory for those who were lost. He makes it all about himself, doesn't allow others to move on because he himself cannot. When he escapes custody, he puts many people at risk, easily could have taken lives. This being beautifully contrasted in the next scene, with Mark talking about how important it is to reflect on the consequences of your actions. But Powerplex doesn't do this. When people do not listen, you just get louder. Like his power, he ramps up his attention seeking more and more. He takes his own wife and child hostage to force Invincible's hand. When the world didn't understand, when it didn't give the response he wanted, he just got louder. Scott is unwell. This constant escalation, this need for approval of his ways, is self-destructive. So far, no one had died, but people were getting caught up in his quest for justice. It would only be so long till somebody did die. Waiting in the ruins of his sister's house, he shows clear as day his inability to move on, literally clinging to the past. Mark tried to talk him down, not to meet violence with violence. Again, the brilliance of Powerplex's power. If you don't hit him, don't engage with him, then he loses his power. Without anyone to listen, he has nothing but himself. He became the very thing he hated because revenge is self-destroying. He lost his sister and niece, but at least he had his wife and child. But because of his fixation on revenge, of not letting go and moving on, he now lost them too. Killing his wife and son with his own two hands. Yet even after this, he still blames Invincible, because he is incapable of taking responsibility. With his family now dead, the only thing he has left is his hatred for Invincible. And so Invincible embraces Powerplex and takes it all on. All of his hatred, lets Scott vent all his anger until he has nothing left, nothing but tears. To move on, you need to cry, need to grieve, need to process the grief and not latch onto revenge. Powerplex, in short, was one unable to process his feelings, unable to cry, so instead turned to anger, directing it like lightning towards the easiest targets. But his hate got louder and louder as he tried to get others to accept he was right, and as a result, he caused more and more harm till he became the very thing he blamed Invincible for. He was consumed by his trauma and made it everybody else's problem. Now, something both these characters help to demonstrate is the weight of violence and of trauma, of how such experiences can drag you down. Much like the cycle of revenge, it can lead you down a path to become as bad as those who caused you such pain to begin with. Trauma can shape people, can poison them and make them go against their own ideals. Angstrom went from not wanting any lives to be lost, to unleashing a horrendous catastrophe upon the world, doing the complete opposite of creating a utopia. Powerplex, despite doing all he did for the sake of his dead sister and niece, went on to cause a repeat of that same tragedy, except this time not being powerless to stop it, but being actively responsible. The trauma Powerplex suffered poisoned him, and that poison trickled down until it affected his family too. In short then, trauma, be it deserved or not, can warp you into a shell of your former self, make you commit acts completely opposite to your own ideals, be it destroying the world instead of saving it, or killing your family instead of protecting it. But that can't be the end, right? You can't just go off the deep end and not be able to return, right? Of course not, and Invincible himself stands as the shining example. He was beat to near death by his father, told his mother was just a pet. His entire life was ripped apart, everything he believed in was torn down by his own father. He was told his bonds, everything he cared for, was a load of shit. But did he direct all his hatred towards his father? Did he become obsessed with revenge? No, he processed those feelings and he accepted them. He got back up and stayed true to his ideals in spite of his trauma, in spite of the pain he felt, the violence inflicted upon him. He remained a hero fighting for what he thought was right. He was strong enough to shoulder the burden of his trauma. He wasn't weak like Angstrom or Scott, and so he didn't turn down a dark path like them. And in the end, maybe his influence as one who stands opposed to their dissent, as one who rose up instead when confronted with violence and trauma, will rub off with them for the better. And so concludes the show-only part of this video. From here on out, I will be discussing the resolutions to Angstrom and Powerplex's characters, which is yet to be animated, so spoilers incoming, do be warned. Now, as said previously, a big theme of Invincible is how we are shaped not just by our choices, but by the trauma and violence the world delivers upon us. I mean, take the Viltrumites, a race defined by violence, a race that inflicted trauma on itself by constantly culling itself, with Mark only being called a true Viltrumite by General Krieg after suffering through one of the most violent beatdowns of his life. Within the end, what redeems these violent warriors being the love of connection on Earth, of using their power not to hurt others but defend others. They reshape the nature of their violence. In other words, they come to understand the Viltrum way is not healthy, something I talk about in my Conquest video, linked up top, and that they must grow past this way of life to become a prosperous and happy race. And the same idea applies to Angstrom and Powerplex also. Both come to see the truth, they accept their actions for what they are. A scared trauma response, a way to understand their own feelings by projecting it onto the world. Angstrom, after the events of the Invincible War, hunted Mark down once again trying to make him pay for his crimes, and in the process he talks to Eve. And what does Eve do? She tells Angstrom he caused the death of Rex, how he caused her the same level of trauma Mark apparently caused him. And yet, she isn't seeking revenge on him. No, she moved on, rebuilt her life and grew as a person. She used the loss of Rex, her trauma, as a lesson to live each day to its fullest, because you never know what's around the corner. As she says, her happy life with Mark is her reward for not focusing on revenge. She refused to be dragged down to his level, she moved on, and as a result, she is happy. And he is an angry mess of a man who can only cling to revenge. And what does this speech of hers do? Well, it gets through to Angstrom. He realises he could have been doing so much more. If he'd accepted this trauma for what it was, an accident caused by his own actions, he could have moved on and got back to his mission. And so he apologises, he surrenders, and most importantly, he accepts whatever punishment they think he deserves. He doesn't just say sorry and call it a day, he takes accountability, not just for the actions that led to him looking this way, but for all the horrid acts he committed. He wants to one day do good to the world, but only after he has paid for his crimes. Sure, he did end up dying a pretty painful death in Mohawk Mark's dimension, perhaps an appropriate ending for him depending on who you ask, but the point is he reflected and tried to make amends. Something obviously contrasted by Mark in this very arc, whose own hatred for Angstrom and his thirst for revenge hurts the people he cares for most. Much like Powerplex did, a character who also comes to learn this lesson, who instead of using his hate for Invincible to vent his feelings, instead channels them into helping others. Before Invincible showed up, he was of great help in the aftermath of the Invincible War, and was an active hero as part of the Actioneers. His own violent tendencies disappeared the moment Invincible did, for the same reason he never showed hatred for Omni-Man, because his trauma needed to be directed, and hating Mark was the easiest route it could take, but not the most productive. He started to put his life back together with Invincible off-world, but the moment he saw him again, like an addict, he was higher for revenge once again. Invincible really does ruin Powerplex's life, but it's not Mark's fault, it's all on Scott, and Scott comes to understand this. The Mark failed to save people, yes, but if he hadn't been there trying, then many more would have died. Scott has to accept his own fault, that his family died, that if he just lets go he can live a happy and productive life. Only by accepting that does he escape the shadow of his trauma and is able to start anew. What I think the point of these two characters is to show us what trauma can do to a person, what violence can shape one into, but more importantly shows us how what these two did was the wrong way to process this trauma. They couldn't move on because they picked bad methods, and instead needed to be shown the right way by Mark and Eve. Only then did they have a chance at moving on. In a story so saturated with violence, what one should take away is that you should never allow yourself to be tainted by said violence. Don't let your trauma define you, nor let it fuel your actions. As if you do so, all you'll do is hurt yourself and others, inflicting the same pain you feel onto those around you, and never being able to smile or cry again.
And if you want to support this channel even further, then perhaps pledge to my Patreon, or consider becoming a channel member, so you can get your name at the end of the video, like Rinjack9696, Mr. Sputum, Marimo, Jack Hammer, Zolby and Eric Hinton.